I sat on my usual bar stool at the Black Harp, savoring the quiet moment with my lager while waiting for Helen to arrive for our weekly date night. Once she did, the evening would be alcohol-free, so I was taking my time, appreciating the crisp taste of my drink. Then, someone had the nerve to sit next to me, disrupting my peace. "Brown ale, please, Molly," he called out. I shifted uncomfortably, already anticipating how awkward this was about to get. Picking up my phone, I fidgeted with it briefly before setting it back down on the counter. Instead of acknowledging him immediately, I took 3 slow swallows of my beer, letting the taste settle, feeling the slight fizz at the back of my throat. Then I finally spoke. "Joel, you're an absolute disgrace." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him set his glass down, now only half full of that rich amber ale he always favored. "That's fair, Adrian," he admitted quietly. "I guess I am." I turned toward him, my so-called best friend, feeling a surge of anger so intense that, for a brief second, I had to fight back the urge to grab him by the collar. "What in the world were you thinking?" A long pause followed before he exhaled heavily. "I wasn't thinking, I was feeling. It was more about emotion than desire." "Really? Because that's not the version I heard. For crying out loud, how could you?" "How could I not?" he countered. For a moment, I was too stunned to respond. My fingers tensed, as if searching for something to do before I let my frustration take over. "Listen," I finally said, my voice sharp. "I get it. Ivy has the looks, the charm, the kind of appeal that turns heads. But she's nothing compared to Evelyn. Except emotionally," he said. "At least, that's what I thought." "That's nonsense, and you know it. Evelyn loves you completely." He gave a non-committal hum. "She loves me, sure, but she hasn't been in love with me for a long time." "That's a load of garbage. Helen and I have been best friends with both of you for 7 years, ever since our first days at university. You two have always been inseparable, practically joined at the hip. Don't stand there and tell me she isn't in love with you, because I'll call you a liar. Say whatever you want. I messed up, I know. But that doesn't change the fact that she fell out of love with me." I shook my head, frustration churning inside me. This was Joel. More than a best friend, closer than my own brother. And Evelyn? I cared about her just as much. There are people you meet in life who simply become part of your world. You bond with them in a way that feels effortless. You want them in your circle, sharing moments, laughing, confiding, celebrating victories, and helping each other through failures. That was us, 2 couples, 4 best friends. Helen and I, Joel and Evelyn, we had met as students at the University of Edinburgh. None of us were Scottish, all of us feeling a little lost in the grand old halls and cramped laboratories packed with cutting-edge technology. The place had been around for over 400 years, yet it demanded nothing short of excellence from those who walked its halls. Less than 10% of applicants got accepted, and we knew how lucky we were. The first-year students clung to each other like nervous sheep, wary of the academic wolves waiting to test them. The pressure was immense, the expectations overwhelming. Most coped by forming tight-knit friendships, or, failing that, drowning their stress in alcohol. That's how we found each other, first as individuals, then as couples. Me with Helen Voss, Joel with Evelyn Fairbanks. For 3 years, we studied together, worked together, and lived through everything university life threw at us. And no, it wasn't the kind of arrangement where lines got blurred. There was no swapping partners, no reckless entanglements. Just 2 couples built so securely that there was no room for anyone else. We fit together perfectly, like those ancient Egyptian stone blocks carved so precisely that you couldn't slide a blade between them. Helen and I were solid, and Joel and Evelyn, if anything, they seemed even closer. So what was this nonsense he was trying to sell me now? "Joel, look me in the eye and say that again." He turned, meeting my gaze, and that was when I saw it. The truth. "I don't get it," I admitted, feeling helpless. Was there someone else?" Even as I asked, I rejected the thought outright. No, Evelyn would never. "Forget I said that," I muttered quickly. "I wouldn't believe it anyway." He let out a dry chuckle, exhaling sharply through his nose. "No, she didn't cheat on me. Not physically. I still don't understand. You just convinced yourself she was interested in someone else?" "It wasn't about intimacy," he said, exasperated by my refusal to grasp what he was saying. "That's not what you originally said," I shot back. You claimed it wasn't physical on your side. That's not the same thing. Besides, it clearly was about intimacy for you." He shook his head. "No, it wasn't. Sure, intimacy happened. But that wasn't the point. It was about searching for something I had lost, something I couldn't go on without." "Joel, if you can't go without intimacy for a few months," he shrugged. "That wasn't the issue. It was never about that. For the first time since we'd met, I lost my temper with him. My palm came down hard on the bar, the sharp sound cutting through the chatter around us. Then you better come up with a real explanation. Fast," I snapped. "Because right now, you're making 0 sense." The outburst turned heads. A few patrons glanced our way, and even the barmaid eyed us warily. Embarrassed, I lowered my voice. "And you'd better make it quick, because Helen is going to be here any minute. And believe me, she is not in the mood for your nonsense. You broke our trust almost as much as you did Evelyn's. And right now, she's got a whole lot of resentment toward you, mate." "All right," Joel sighed. "I'll try to explain." He turned to the barmaid. "Another round, please." I thought about our date night rules. Helen and I had agreed on a no-drinking policy for the evening. But given everything that had happened, I knew she'd bend the rules in a heartbeat if it meant getting to the bottom of what had gone wrong between our friends. Ever since the news broke, she'd been more emotional than usual, a little more fragile. At night, we held on to each other like two people bracing against a storm, because if even Joel and Evelyn, who had once seemed unshakable, could fall apart, what did that mean for the rest of us? The drinks arrived, but I let mine sit untouched. No matter how tense this conversation got, Helen wouldn't appreciate me being even slightly buzzed when she walked through the door, and her opinion of me mattered more than just about anything else. Joel had no such concerns. He picked up his pint and downed half of it in one go. "All right," he said, setting the glass down. "Let me explain." His gaze drifted across the pub, as if searching for the right words. "When I met Evelyn, it was like someone flipped a switch inside me. You and Helen clicked right away, became friends almost instantly. But for me, the moment I saw Evelyn, I just knew. Love at first sight. As ridiculous as that sounds, it's the truth." A self-conscious smile crossed his face. "I know, it sounds corny. If someone else had told me that, I'd probably be embarrassed for them. I've never admitted it before, but that's how it was. I remember everything about that first moment. The way her clothes fit, the exact shade of her lipstick, the light touch of her eye makeup. She wore these long earrings that made her neck look even more elegant. Even the rings on her fingers stood out to me. But most of all, I remember her eyes. The way she looked at me, like I wasn't just another guy trying to get close to her for the usual reasons. Like I was someone worth knowing. Coming from my background, that meant everything." Yeah, his background. Parents who barely deserved the title, swinging between neglect and cruelty, depending on how much alcohol was in their system. It had left Joel with a sharp mind but almost no self-confidence, a rough combination. I'd always known he was crazy about Evelyn, but I hadn't realized just how deep it ran. Thinking back, though, it made sense. It had to have been love that gave him the nerve to approach her despite his tendency to doubt himself. When she agreed to go out with me, it felt like I had won the lottery without even buying a ticket. And from that first date, everything just worked. I found myself telling her things I had never shared with anyone, things I never even let myself think about too much. But with her, it felt safe. She just understood. She took in all the messy parts of me, filtered out the worst, and reflected back something better. Being with her felt like stepping into sunlight for the first time. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. For a while, I held back. I kept waiting for it to fall apart, to wake up and realize it had all been a dream. But it didn't. It just kept getting better. And I kept giving more of myself, bit by bit, because I finally believed it was real. We could talk for hours, about anything, about everything. We'd go out for the evening, spend all night talking, and then go home and keep the conversation going over Skype until the sun came up. He gave a small, wry smile. One time, we talked for 13 hours straight. Yeah, I timed it. Not intentionally at first, but after a while I got curious. She was the first person I never got tired of talking to. We covered everything: life, dreams, random nonsense, the meaning of it all. He took another sip of his drink before glancing at me. "You and I talk. The four of us talk. And some of those conversations, they're some of the best I've ever had. We break things down, analyze, put them back together in new ways. We communicate better than most people ever do. His voice trailed off, and I could see the weight of it all settling over him. I just didn't understand. How had they gone from that? 13-hour conversations, a bond so deep he could still recall the exact shade of her lipstick, to this. And more importantly, why was he standing here, throwing it all away? But Evelyn and I were even more in sync than that. I know everything. Her first pet, first date, first kiss, and the boy she shared that moment with. And not just the facts, but how she felt about each of them. She knows about the worst nights I had growing up. The best moments, too. The pain of losing my sister to meningitis, and how I used to shut myself off from the world to cope. We didn't just share experiences. We felt each other's joy and grief like they were our own. We knew each other's strengths and weaknesses, our hopes, our fears, everything that made us who we are. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. You remember how terrified I was about proposing to her? To me, what we had was already perfect. I didn't think a piece of paper or a ceremony in front of people, or swearing an oath to a God neither of us believed in, would make it any more real. But I also knew deep down that, for Evelyn, marriage meant something. That public declaration, standing up in front of the world and saying, "This is us, we belong to each other." She needed that. I nodded. No kidding. I had practically held him upright at the altar while he waited for Evelyn to appear at the end of the aisle, pale as a ghost, hands shaking. I was scared that making it official would change things, that the perfection we had built would somehow fade, that we'd stop putting in the effort. I got that. When Helen and I married a few months later, I had the same thoughts, but my parents had always been rock solid. My whole life, I'd seen their relationship as proof that marriage didn't have to mean complacency. Joel, though, had no such reassurance from his upbringing. But it did change, he went on, taking another sip of his ale. It actually got better. I kept having to redefine what perfection even was. He set his glass down with a soft clink. In the 4 years we were married, we must have spent more than 20,000 hours just being close, holding each other, making love, curled up on the couch, spooning in bed, reading together in the bath, fingers intertwined while walking down the street. It was like we weren't just partners. We were trying to fuse into one person. Physically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally. And yeah, I know how that sounds, like some weird sci-fi horror, but that's what it felt like. Like I had been split open from top to bottom, and she lived inside every part of me. This was deep. Joel wasn't usually the type to wax poetic about emotions. This was coming straight from a place of raw honesty. I tried to lighten the mood. Like that tauntaun in Star Wars, the one Han Solo stuffed Luke into for warmth. I chuckled, hoping to snap him out of it. He didn't even react. His mind was somewhere else, somewhere painful. And that was what had me unsettled. What had happened? She gave me everything I ever needed, he continued, his voice quieter now. And I tried to be that for her in return. We talked about kids early on. I was always upfront. I didn't want them. It wasn't that I disliked children, but I never saw myself as someone who should pass on his genes. My sister died of meningitis. My parents were alcoholics. I have type 2 diabetes, and half my family tree is riddled with cancer. I didn't want to take the risk of passing that on. At first, Evelyn understood. It wasn't an issue. But as time passed, it became one. She started to feel it more. That ache, that longing. We went in circles, talking it through over and over. She saw my side. She really did. But that didn't change how much she wanted it. And in the end, more than anything else, I just wanted her to be happy. That's what love does to you. Your own happiness stops being the priority. It becomes secondary to theirs. He let out a dry laugh. She stopped taking the pill, and 2 months later, she was pregnant. Another sip of his drink. Adrian, I don't think I've ever seen her happier. Sure, we still had the occasional argument, but most of the time, it was just, joy. A kind of happiness so big, so overwhelming, that it felt like we might burst from it. Even the rough parts didn't feel like struggles. Holding her hair back when she was sick, rubbing her feet after a long day, making love with her when she needed reassurance that she was still beautiful, despite the changes in her body. Holding her at night, when fear about the baby's health kept her awake. And it wasn't one-sided. She was there for me too, Every time I had doubts, every time I worried if we'd made the right decision. She was there, kissing me, holding me, making me believe that everything would be all right. I was addicted to that feeling. I craved it. And through all of it, we never stopped talking. That never changed. We could turn anything into a conversation. Our pasts, our future, the world, philosophy, nonsense. If it existed, we had something to say about it. He paused for a long moment before glancing at me. You and Helen were outside the delivery room when Charlotte was born, but I was with her the whole way through. His expression softened, a flicker of warmth breaking through. She didn't even yell at me once. I always heard that was a thing, that during labor, mothers cursed the fathers to high heaven for putting them in that situation. But not Evelyn. My hand, though, that took a serious beating. Despite all the fears we had confided in each other, Charlotte was born perfectly healthy, just as you know. I mean, you and Helen are her godparents. You've been there through everything. Joel let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. Yeah, that's the reaction I was expecting. I caught sight of my own expression in the mirror behind the bar. A deep frown, my eyes narrowed in disbelief. Oh, come on, I said. All mothers love their babies. Not all, he countered, his tone calm but firm. Mine certainly didn't. He lifted a hand to stop my immediate protest. Don't get me wrong, I love that little girl. I would die for her. If we were in the middle of a zombie attack, I'd rip out my own brain to draw them away from her. But here's the thing. I'm still in love with Evelyn. I opened my mouth to argue, then hesitated, trying to organize my thoughts into something coherent. But, I finally managed. All right, let's put it this way, he said, leaning in slightly. Imagine that one day, Helen is completely in love with you. You're the center of her world, her constant, her guide, her protector, her lover, her best friend. That's how it is, right? I nodded. It was a fair description. Of course, I said, and she's all of that to me, too. And then, the next day, you're not. I blinked at him. What? Maybe she still sees you as a protector, a friend, even a lover in some way, but the rest. It shifts. Suddenly it's all for the child. I opened my mouth to argue, but hesitated again. I wanted to tell him that was just how things were supposed to be. A mother's love for her child should be all-encompassing. How else would babies even survive? Then I thought about the things he had told me over the years about his own mother, and I fell silent. And I never wanted children, he whispered. I only did it to make her happy. That's all I ever wanted. And I know that saying this makes me sound like the worst, most selfish, most unnatural excuse for a man. I don't need you to tell me that. I've already torn myself apart over it. I don't resent my daughter. I love her more than anything. I resent the situation. I resent what her birth changed between Evelyn and me. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Maybe it was because Evelyn loved me so much that I felt it, lived in it, bathed in it daily, that losing that love hurt worse than I could have ever imagined. Other couples have children and go through the same struggles. They have sleepless nights. They deal with the crying, the diapers, the fear that grips you over every rash, every cough, every little sound in the night. But for me, it wasn't just exhaustion. It wasn't just the usual hardships of parenting. One day, I had everything I ever dreamed of. A wife who didn't just love me, but understood me, challenged me, made me a better man. A partner who matched me in every way, who met my thoughts with better ones, who made me strive to be more. And then the next day, I wasn't that person to her anymore. I was an afterthought. And the love that had once made me feel invincible, the love that had shaped every part of my life, was gone, given to someone else. And I couldn't even be angry about it because that someone else was our daughter. I had everything. One day I was drowning in love, the kind of love that most people spend their whole lives searching for. And the next, I was just drowning. He took another long sip of his drink. Call me needy. Call me weak. Say whatever you want. But I was addicted to that love, and suddenly I had to go cold turkey. I felt like I was lost in a storm with no way back. Like I was grieving something no one else could even see was gone. He let out a bitter laugh. I love my daughter, never doubt that. But Evelyn is in love with her. Charlotte is the center of her heart now, and she always will be. And his voice faltered for just a second. I've been pushed to the edges. Those late-night conversations, gone. The deep talks, the laughter, the us that used to exist, all replaced by the same singular topic, every single time, Charlotte. That's why I felt like I was losing my mind. I stared at him, struggling to find the right words. I understood what he was saying, I got it, but it still felt wrong. "Hang on," I said, my tone sharp. "That still doesn't justify cheating on Evelyn." Joel exhaled, shaking his head. "I told you, it wasn't about intimacy. I know how that sounds, but it's the truth. I was an addict in withdrawal. And like the worst kind of addict, I needed a fix." He set his glass down a little too forcefully. "Ivy was there, part of a project at work. I may be selfish, maybe even broken, but I'm not stupid. I knew for months that she had a crush on me. She was smart, sharp-witted, full of energy. And most of all, she talked to me. Conversations that weren't just about baby schedules or sleepless nights or pediatrician visits. She reminded me of the kind of connection I used to have. And I let myself be weak. I let myself reach for something I had no business touching." His voice was almost hollow now. "I wanted to be loved again, the way Evelyn used to love me, the way I still loved her. But she didn't need it anymore. She already had someone who loved her with their whole heart. And it wasn't me." And so, in my weakest moment, I turned to Ivy. We had dinner, talked for hours, just like Evelyn and I used to. We ended up at her flat, and for a long time we just lay there, wrapped around each other, talking and holding on. It was a slow, inevitable progression, I suppose. Evelyn and I hadn't been intimate in nearly 8 months. I was an easy target. That doesn't excuse it, but that's how it happened. Joel exhaled, staring at the amber liquid in his glass. The worst part wasn't even the intimacy itself. It was the betrayal of sharing my thoughts with someone else. That was what truly broke everything. And when I got home, late enough for it to be obvious, Evelyn knew immediately. She didn't know the details, but she didn't need to. I had never lied to her before, and I wasn't about to start then. It didn't even cross my mind. I answered every question she asked, and when I was done, she threw me out. She was screaming, Charlotte was crying. It was chaos. And in that moment, it hit me in the worst way. They were a unit, the two of them, a partnership. And I was on my own. He turned to me then, his expression raw. "You're my best friend. Probably my only friend now, unless you're done with me too. So tell me, what do I do?" The answer should have been simple. He had to fight for his marriage, do everything in his power to get Evelyn to forgive him. That was the obvious choice. She loved him, needed him, even if things had changed. But then I hesitated. What if he was right? What if this wasn't just about a mistake, but about something deeper, something that had already shifted beyond repair? What if he went back and spent the rest of his life settling for less than what he had once known? Would that be enough for him? Should it be? Once you've held something that perfect, could you ever truly accept less? In the end, I found myself offering him the only compromise I could. "I think you need to tell Evelyn exactly what you just told me, word for word. She's at least as sharp as you are, and she deserves to hear it straight from you. And if you don't think she'll listen, I'll do it for you. I'll make sure she hears it, exactly as you meant it." I was certain I could. He pressed his lips together, nodding slowly. "I really appreciate that. I don't think she'd even acknowledge me right now. Honestly, I think she wouldn't bother putting out a fire if I was the one burning. But maybe, if you talk to her, she'll at least hear me out. Maybe she'll have a solution I haven't thought of." He drained the last of his drink and ran a hand through his hair. "I'm at the Royal in town. It's the off-season, so I can afford it for a little while. After that, I guess I'll figure things out depending on how this plays out." Then he looked at me, the weight of everything behind his words. "You're the best friend a guy could ask for. You know that?" He paid the tab for both of us, then pulled me into one of those half-hug, chest-bump gestures men do, just enough contact to acknowledge the bond, but not so much that it felt too close. Then he left, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Cold, heavy thoughts. 20 minutes later, Helen arrived, bundled in her thick winter coat. It made her look heavier than she was, though in truth her growing baby bump was mostly to blame. I liked to tell myself it was just the coat, that nothing had changed, that her figure was still as lithe and graceful as ever. She frowned at my half-finished beer, but barely paid it any mind once I told her about Joel. Then she was all focus, listening intently to the recording I had made on my phone. Her expression was locked in concentration, brows drawn, eyes darting as if mentally dissecting every word. She shook her head at times, sighed at others, and every time I tried to interject, she waved a hand to shush me, never taking her eyes off the screen. Then she played it again. I stayed quiet this time, letting her absorb it, finishing my beer as I watched her process. When the recording ended, she tapped the screen to close it and finally looked up at me. Without a word, she reached for my beer, took a single sip, then grimaced and handed it back. She had never liked beer. "What do you think Evelyn will say when we play this for her?" I asked. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice heavy with uncertainty. I studied her carefully. "What would you say?" She didn't answer right away. We were like Joel and Evelyn in so many ways, two halves of a whole, perfectly matched. If anyone could understand their situation, it was us. But her silence stretched. She stared down at the bar, deep in thought, her fingers brushing absently over her belly. "I don't know," she whispered at last. And when she finally lifted her gaze to meet mine, her hands pressing protectively over the life growing inside her, I saw something I wasn't expecting. A fear so deep it was bottomless.